these are five nation states, so geographically apart from each other. But in all these nation states, there is one slogan which is so powerful, namely, all Muslims are not terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims.
And so then when you bring that difference between real and true, what does that mean?
In the case of India, you have W. Hunter, who wrote that book called Indian Muslims. Are they bound in conscience to rebel against the Queen? By the way, let me note here that after 9/11, Rupa, which is a leading publisher in India, they published that book and deleted the subtitle.
Again, because we are talking about terrorism and we are going to deconstruct it. To begin with, what do you think is terrorism?
Rather than asking the question, who is the terrorist, what motivates them, I pose a counter question that who needs the label or the category of terrorist?
And in that sense, why do you think that, especially in context with terrorism as understanding, why was Islam made exceptional?
So in the book, I also talk about the current Prime Minister of Israel. He edited a book, and the whole conclusion of that book is that Arabs are terrorists, and Arabs alone are terrorists.
Especially when you mentioned the word hurriyat within your book itself, you open that gateway. What is it that decoloniality brings, and what is it that the limit of it?
You have educated very consciously through media, through non-formal channels, a whole generation in which the impression is that jihad is a dirty word and it is completely against the self-view of Muslims.
Two things I would want to talk about: law as a structure of the state itself, and media as a form of potentially creating that structure through consent.
Decolonial is a negative referent. Okay, so we need to decolonize ourselves, which I think is a worthy exercise. But can we also ask a question, and that is, what is the positive agenda that we have?
So when you say the fanatic is a radical partisan of freedom, so to state, what do you mean by that?
And I'm not simply interested in reality in terms of the fact that as they exist or as it happens or as it is operating. I'm also believing in a moral world which doesn't exist, but which in my view should exist.
नाउस एक इंडिपेंडेंट थिंक टैंक मीडिया प्लेटफॉर्म है जो माइनॉरिटी और ह्यूमन राइट्स के इश्यूज पर रिसर्च और एविडेंस बेस्ड कॉन्वर्सेशंस को एम्पलीफाई करता है। इसे और मजबूत बनाने के लिए नाउस को सब्सक्राइब करें और सपोर्ट करें। So, Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Professor Irfan Ahmad. How are you? It's been a long
I'm all good.
We recorded a podcast with you on Hindu Orientalism and the idea wherein you deployed the frameworks of power, knowledge, and hegemony in the special context of the experience of Indian Muslims and how power and knowledge is manufactured in the Indian state context. And similarly, now you have come up with a very exciting work, because I went through it and it gave me real in-depth perspectives of about the idea of terrorism, which we take for granted even from the response side. The idea that terrorism is just a construct that is made up in a certain way for the state to deploy against a certain minority, specifically Muslims. But to be able to understand it from anthropological perspective, social theory perspective, even potentially the metaphysics of violence itself, particularly deployed in this day and age for a global enemy, especially located in Islam, and what you argue that it was once located in the Cold War era for communism. So that transition and translation of a category of violence into a certain reified concept that is deployed, engaged to marginalize, to systematically counter the Muslim experiences or the manifestation of Muslim life into the public sphere. So my question would be, again, because we are talking about terrorism and we're going to deconstruct it, to begin with, what do you think is terrorism in the way that it was defined, and then in the way it was later evolved to encapsulate or inhabit a certain way in which that category is understood in common nomenclature right now?
Yeah, so thank you. This is a very effective way of framing, and I'm happy to be again on Nous network. Now, back to your question. So, the question of definition is, of course, important, but the point is there is no agreed universal definition of terrorism. And a document of United Nations in 2015, it clearly admits that there is no universal definition of terrorism. They also use the word terrorism and radicalization as substitute. So in that document, and that is the Oslo conference of which I do an ethnography. So I raise this question that if you do not have a definition, how you will find ways to counter it. Okay, so there is already a contradiction in that document, but also note Alex Smith, who is a very well-known expert of terrorism, and in 1985 he gave almost 200 definition of terrorism. Sorry, he didn't give. He compiled. He recorded all that definition. And in 2005, so this more than 200 definition was in 1985. In 2005, he again came back to this definition question to say that the search for a consensual definition continues. Now, the third point is, if you just take the example of one state, and here I'm talking about America, the US State Department, okay, and the US Department of Defense, and the CIA. These are three organs of the same state, and they do not have one agreed definition. Each agency has a definition of its own. And partly it is also embedded into the institutional history of the respective organization. So any scholar of terrorism, or more broadly of any phenomenon, I do not, to the extent that I'm knowledgeable, I do not know of any concept in social science or humanities which has a universally agreed definition. Okay, and that is one reason in one of the chapters, the opening shot is a couplet from an Urdu poet, that किसी को अपने अमल का हिसाब क्या देते, सवाल सारे गलत थे, जवाब क्या देते. Because definition is an act of boundary making. It is an act of, in Arabic, a definition is also known as had bandi. I'm mixing Urdu and Arabic. So it is to demarcate, it is to differentiate. So this process is definitely at work in the question of terrorism as well. Okay, so anybody who explores this subject, then he will be driven, he or she will be driven to ask this question, that, okay, if we cannot define it, then what is the other way in which we can approach this question? And for me, in this book, but more broadly in my general work, I thought that the question of definition will not lead us anywhere. Which is not to say that I'm not saying that for a particular purpose you can define, but lay out the assumptions, okay? And therefore, rather than asking the question, who is the terrorist, what motivates them, what are their ideologies or what are their beliefs, I pose a counter question that who needs the label or the category of terrorist? And this counter question, to me, it allows us to ask a different set of questions, okay, including the fundamental question which is central to the thriving industry which terrorism study is, namely, who is a terrorist? So my point is to summarize it by asking the question who needs the category of terrorist, we open up a new horizon of thinking and also action. And in that process, we can also address the question which is the mainstream question, namely, who is the terrorist?
It's like it just clicked my mind. It's like asking the question, what is a house and who needs a house? So if you ask that question, what is a house, you would give the answers, a place to live where there is furniture. When you ask the question, who needs a house, then the whole anthropology of humans needing that house in the first place arises, and that genealogy then demands to be constructed. So in that context, if you pose that question, and if you pose that question in the context of terrorism, how did that word specifically evolved to be identified as a question which is fundamentally intertwined to a certain ideology or identity, being Muslim or be following Islam? How did that happen?
So that is why, as you will notice, the scope of the book is, of course, the general question of terrorism. But the focus is on post 9/11 terrorism. And one of the ways in which the post 9/11 terrorism has been described or defined, okay, is this. There are two main components of this definition. The first one is that this is primarily a religious phenomenon. And once it is defined as religious, then the implication is that it is also Islamic. Now, if it is a religious, so post 9/11 terrorism is defined as religious, then the point would be, if it is religious terrorism, then does it obtain only in Islam, or do you also have in Hinduism, do you have also in Buddhism, do you also have in Christianity, do you also have in Judaism, do you also have in Zoroastrianism, and so on and so forth? No, because you do not hear a word called Jewish terrorism. You do not hear a word called Christian terrorism. You do not hear a term called Hindu terrorism, right? So the uniqueness of this post 9/11 terrorism is defined in terms of religious terrorism, number one. And number two, and this is a huge departure, by the way, okay, from the existing corpus of scholarship, namely that terrorism throughout most of the history has been defined as a tactic. Okay, it is a means through which a particular group wants to achieve certain things. Okay, but in the name of the so-called new terrorism, this has been transformed from a tactic to ideology, and one which is religious. So these are the two fundamental dimension of so-called new terrorism, which some associate exactly with the 9/11, some take it further back, and so on and so forth. The third component is also, by the way, worth mentioning, which is to say that in modern history, at least, the terrorism has been also, or in many significant ways, it is also associated with the state terrorism. So after the French Revolution, this is the Jacobin who let loose a reign of terror. That is the French example back to the subcontinent, okay, after the failed rebellion of 1857. Historians have described the scene that the British army they killed people in Delhi, and their dead body was hung by the tree. And this is from an uh, British source. These dead bodies were hung by the tree to strike terror in the residents of Delhi. Okay? Now, what is the point emerging from this? That in post 9/11 terrorism, people were simply talking about terrorism from the non state actors. Okay? But the fact that historically terrorism has been also associated with the state, okay, that was almost wiped out. So what the book does, it of course it talks about pre 9/11 terrorism as well, and the clear cut distinction that some scholars make. Okay, for example, that communism was the main enemy of the West-led world system after World War II. Okay, and in the last phase of that Cold War, okay, this is during the time of Reagan, that terrorism was identified as enemy, and then there is some transition phase, but then it was mostly Reagan's thing about the war on drug and war on terrorism. Okay, but that is also the time because Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, right? And then America was also supporting the resistance posed by the Afghan fighters. Okay, and then from the late 80s, and then you have uh, the inauguration of so-called New World Order by George W. Bush Sr. And that inauguration of the so-called New World Order takes place after the fall of USSR and after the fall of Berlin Wall. Uh, now, this is some kind of neat narrative which is presented, but I argue in the book that it is not actually as neat as it is made out to be, because among others, Bernard Lewis, okay, he had already said, uh, I will have to check the exact year, but probably late 50s and early 60s, when communism was the main enemy of the Western led world, he had made an argument that Islam is just like communism. So, in other words, if you make an argument that, okay, after World War II, the Western led world system had identified communism as the enemy, and then it was replaced by Islam, okay, uh, soon after 9/11 or just before 9/11, then it is not such a neat divided phase wise story, because during the Cold War itself, Bernard Lewis had made a strong similarity between communism and Islam. So, this in brief would be a general picture of the place of the enemy after World War II, first in the figure of communism, and then uh, more explicitly uh, after 9/11 in the form of Islam or terrorism.
So when we hear about these debates and discussions, often Huntington's thesis comes to the forefront about the clash of civilizations that would be the future of the way civilizations rather than states would engage in warfare in whatever means possible amongst each other. And in that sense, why do you think that, especially in context with terrorism as understanding, why was Islam made exceptional after communism? Why does that category get embodied within an ideology and an identity that becomes Islam as the universal other? So, is there certain reading that you have in which this framework privileges Islam as the embodied other when it comes to this kind of violence?
Yeah, so one quick response. I think Huntington is not an original thinker on this point. The idea of clash of civilization, actually, it is
It's the
already given
30s.
by Bernard Lewis, you know. And in one account, now many people in India don't mention him, but Girilal Jain, who was the editor of Times of India for quite some time, you know, uh, who also wrote a book which is, I think, called The Hindu Phenomenon. So,
Hmm.
in one account, Girilal Jain has also mentioned about clash of civilization. Okay, but that is just a minor point. So, the reasons can be many, but it seems to me uh, that it can be analyzed at one level, and that is what I have done, which is to say that the system of the nation state, okay, which has been built after World War II. Now, this was an experiment which was quite a novel experiment in history. Okay, so before World War One, the world was not known in terms of nation state. So once you create this idea of nation state, and it is true, by the way, that this idea of the nation state was novel to most religious and cultural tradition. Okay, but I think the opposition to this idea, or the fact that Muslims did not find it in line with their own cultural and religious traditions. So uh, I would say that one of the most important voices of resistance against this nation state system has been from the Muslims. Okay, and this is also true, by the way, as you know, after World War One, in the wake of the abolition of Khilafat.
Hmm.
Okay, what was previously Ottoman Empire, it was divided into 32 nation states. Now, here we have to pause and ask a question: that did people of Iraq really wanted a nation state? Okay, did people of Syria really want a nation state? So, unlike, for example, in India, where you had a colonial government against which people fought, and then an idea of independence and so on and so forth were there. What you have in the Middle East, that of course the French and the British, they incited the local population to weaken the Ottoman Empire, and all these nation states, they were implanted. This was not because the people in the Middle East really wanted it. Okay, it was given to them in spite of their wish. It is not the case that they gained or they fought for it and then they achieved it. Now, if it looks not so convincing, so let me give you an example. When Iraq was announced as the independent nation state, okay, so unlike in India, of course, there has been debate what should be the national song or national anthem. Iraqis had no national anthem. So in the ceremony which announced the creation of Iraq as a separate state, it is the British anthem which is played. Long live the king of Britain. Now, having said this, let me also say that, of course, these nation states were created, but people in the Middle East, which itself is a colonial term, by the way, the term Middle East was invented by Alfred Mahan, who was a Navy a scholar of naval trade and so on and so forth. Okay, so people in the Middle East, of course, they accept that nation state boundaries, but this is not something which has organically emerged since it has been artificially planted. So they also identify with the larger idea or the pre nation state sense of community. social community, political community, and cultural community. So that is one reason. And the second one is, of course, I think in the case of Middle East, Israel has been a key player. And this discourse of terrorism would not be on the international plane after 9/11 without uh, Israel. So in the book, I also talk about the current Prime Minister of Israel. I think he was some kind of diplomatic officer in the 80s or something. And then he edited a book with dozens of articles, which was criticized by Edward Said. And then this is the USSR had not fallen, but in that book he says that look, the world faces threat, and by world he means the Western world, in which he includes Israel, right? Which itself is a very problematic thing. That how come Israel is a Western state? So by the world, he means the Western world, he means the Western countries, but Israel included. And the whole conclusion of that book is that Arabs are terrorists and Arabs alone are terrorists. So much of this thing is centered around that Middle Eastern context. Now, in India, when the first UAPA came much later, initially it was POTA, right? Prevention of Terrorism Act or something. Okay. So if you see there, I think I'm forgetting the name. There was a subcommittee which gave a context to the legislative piece, and it says that terrorism has emerged from Middle East. I stand corrected, but I think it is Malamuth Committee or something like that. In addition to these factors, then you have to also see that Muslims minority also in the West, in France, in Britain, the largest number of Muslim minority in European country is in France. So it also became a pivot around which these nation states could consolidate themselves and organize themselves, because what you have here is that the so-called the socialist, after the collapse of the USSR, they got weakened, and as a mobilizing tool, okay, in India, of course, it is connected to the international global politics, but there is a regional dimension, because in India, if you have to talk about terrorism in France, you don't need to mention Pakistan. But in India, you cannot talk about terrorism without mentioning Pakistan and later on also Bangladesh, right? So the debate is localized in the case of India, but this localization is done in such a way that it also speaks to the larger international context.
For example, Benjamin Netanyahu, as you argued rightly, that the way he constructed the idea of Arab terrorist also inherited in within his framework Israel being part of the Western paradigmatic framework, and as a frontier state defending the modern liberal values in terms of the new world order that you mentioned had been conceived by West itself. So Israel becomes the bastion of the protection of the liberal human rights on behalf of the Western communities and societies. So similarly, India can also deploy that in terms of the local geopolitics of Southeast Asia, if I'm rightly understanding what you're arguing.
True, and also take note of the fact that when Israel talks about terrorism as a threat to its own existence and terrorism from Arabs slash Muslims, it completely erases the fact that the birth of Israel is possible through terrorist activities.
Yeah.
There are two organizations called Irgun,
Hmm.
and I think the other one is called Levi or something.
Mhm.
But these were two terrorist organizations. And by the way, note the fact that these terrorist organizations, they simply morphed into Israeli defense force.
Hmm. later,
with the
after the
crea-
formation
with,
of Israel.
with the creation of Israel as a state. And before 1948, and the book also gives a quotation, you have many leading Israeli politicians, one of them who also became uh, prime minister later on, goes on to record to say that no reading of Jewish ethics, okay, prevents us from using terrorism. So, in other words, they think that at that point of time, that Judaism allows use of terrorism as a means.
Even today,
Okay.
if we see in Gazan context, the way it was recorded in 2018, a journalist went to Israel, and then they asked the questions whether how should Palestinians be treated, and it was normal for them to answer that they should be carpet bombed, they should be killed, they should be annihilated. So that the idea of the activity when it happens towards them because of a privileged God's privileged community, it's an asymmetrical construct, violence in their own might. But also because when you talked about, and when I asked you about the exceptionalism of Islam as an inherited category of something that West after communism wanted to peddle as a violent ideology. So the idea that when you mention that the idea of nation states was imposed on West Asia or Middle East or the Arab states, so their identity had a surplus in a sense that the national identity that was being constructed, as you rightly argued, had a bigger vision or a socio-cultural ties or interactions. Maybe India had a different history, or other places had a different history or a different genealogy. But that specificity of that surplus located in Islam, intertwined with the geopolitical necessities, also combined with this idea of what you argued as the New World Order. So, in that combination, you also mentioned the malaise, the problems that the New World Order created, and how it portrayed those problems on Islam. So, my question would be that this identity, a Muslim who becomes a terrorist, but you also say that in the deployment of that terminology, even the justified, justice oriented demands of that identity gets clubbed into this idea that has been constructed and deployed. So when you say the fanatic is a radical partisan of freedom, so to state, what do you mean by that? How do you see this nation state, new world order, this surplus identity and its own constructs about freedom and equality and justice being marginalized and portrayed into this category that has been constructed?
Right. So this is a very thoughtful question. So uh, you have to see it as follows: the depiction of terrorists slash Muslims, okay, as the ultimate evil, as the ultimate barbarian. Okay, so this is how the West portrayed it, and fanaticism is one trope through which it has been done. So in the book, as you will notice, if you want to use that term, I give a biography of the term fanaticism, and it travels across continents. So, in the case of India, you have W. Hunter, who wrote that book called Indian
Indian
Musalmans.
Muslims.
Are they bound in conscience to rebel against the Queen? This is the full title. By the way, let me note here that after 9/11, Rupa, which is a leading publisher in India, they published that book and deleted the subtitle. So it is simply published as Indian Musalmans. So anyway, now in Hunter's book, fanaticism is one trope. Of course, the book talks about primarily about Bengal, and the book is published in 1871. Okay, but then this word fanaticism, I also trace it in the history of the U.S. and how the people who were fighting against slavery, and those black population which was asserting for equality. Their demand was also, or their modes of protestation was also defined as fanatic. And there is one guy who later on also became, I'm forgetting the name of that person, but later on he became the vice president of America. He said that these fanatics will not simply stop at one particular demand. Later on, they will ask for complete equality. So now the situation here is as follows. So on the one hand, you have the depiction by media industrial security complex of terrorists slash Muslims as ultimate evil, barbarian, anti-modern, and against that depiction, any logical person, and that is where anthropology becomes important in a positive way, because one of the main claims of anthropology is anthropology makes that distinction between emic view and etic view. So emic view is how you see yourself, and etic view is how you are seen by others from outside. So this description of terrorist as enemy of modernity, freedom, enlightenment, equality, and whatever you have, or democracy, that is an etic view. But then the question is, from an anthropological or even from any humane framework, the question is, what is the emic view? How do these people look at themselves? And that is where I do an operation of rehabilitation in terms of rehabilitating the concept of fanaticism, or one who is a fanatic, in the sense of not as the dominant meaning of fanatic is somebody who is not using reason, who is so much in terms of psychic derailment. Okay, he cannot think properly. But then there is another meaning of fanaticism when these people, black people, fighting for equality and against slavery, which is to say that the apologists of slavery described them fanatics because they were really asking for equality in its true sense, right? So that is where if you see in one of the chapters when I talk to quote unquote terrorists who have been jailed in India, and I want to listen to them without being judgmental. I mean, of course, I have my own views, but then the question is also to look at them in emic term, how they see themselves, right? And that is where I present an alternative picture. Unlike the Western depiction of such notions as jihad, because jihadism, jihadi terrorism, this became a staple for print media and television media. But there, I go to a journey of retrieving these meanings through the scholarship of Abul Kalam Azad, what it means to be enacting jihad. And you will see that I also published a pamphlet, which was from, I think, early 90s from Aligarh Muslim University, where the pamphlet is in Urdu, and it says that this is a group of students, okay, who published a pamphlet saying that we are doing a jihad jamhuriyat or azadi ke liye, a jihad for democracy and freedom. Okay, so this is a counter reading. So against this mediatized depiction of jihad as something which is which can only be dark, reactionary, and repressive, I give an understanding of jihad through these so-called terrorists who have been put in jail through these pamphlets, and then going back to Abul Kalam Azad and so on and so forth. So this is important because let's note that I think the question of justice and fairness is not simply a question in terms of sharing political power or in politics, the question of justice and fairness is also in terms of what might be described as narrative equality or narrative asymmetry. So, if the media, if the intelligence complex, if the security complex, if the police, judiciary, and as I do in another chapter, all these institutions, more or less, they present one picture, okay, which is the dominant one, and that picture is also reproduced predominantly in a scholarship as well. So, justice, fairness, and equality in the political realm cannot be even thinkable and possible unless we first achieve narrative symmetry or narrative equality. And this is the exercise taken in many chapters of that book, how to achieve, demonstrate with evidence, okay, this narrative symmetry or narrative equality.
Interestingly, from what I hear from you, the way I see it, that by portraying certain demands or certain acts from a certain community in a certain light, and then making it synonymous with words like jihad, which are the internal expressions of justice, adl, equality, what also ends up happening is the externalizing and erasing of the possibility of the Muslim experience as a positive force by creating that boundary and by creating that construct that whenever that vocabulary would be invoked, immediately the response would be otherwise. And in that context, if we talk about the theoretical rot, I mean, when you talk about the new world order, what is it that in the new world order that if terrorists that it portrays its own sickness and displaces it onto its enemies, specifically Islam as terrorism, Islamic expressions as acts of terrorism? How can these two things be seen in the same framework?
Ali, I think I'd go a little bit further and say that actually these words have not been misinterpreted, they have been openly abused. Now, just look at this word. If you do not mind, I can go briefly biographical here. In my PhD thesis, so this is my PhD thesis, which was submitted at University of Amsterdam. In the acknowledgements, okay, because I lost 1 year, so my scholarship was there, but the Dutch government wanted me to produce my birth certificate. Without birth certificate, I would not resume my PhD. Okay, but I don't know. You may have your birth certificate because you are a young person, but I didn't have one. Okay, so I had to be really reborn. So I went to the village where I was born, and then I had to write an application. And the village where I was born, I think there were 10 signatures required, but we could find only 1 or 2 people who could sign it. 90% are thumb, angutha chhap jisko bolte hain. Okay, the
People
thumb
are not
thing.
educated enough to sign
Right.
it. Yeah.
And then it is very funny. It says that this is to certify that Irfan Ahmad, son of Fazil Ahmad, was born here. And then with that, you go to block officer and so on and so forth. Anyway, so in this, which is my PhD thing, in the acknowledgements, I say that I undertook a legal jihad against the bureaucratic system of Holland or Europe. So for me, this is, I mean, it didn't make any sense to me because my passport already has date of birth.
Yeah. Yes, it
Okay,
is.
my matriculation document has date of birth, but the Dutch government is insisting on birth certificate. So to me, the demand did not look very reasonable. But anyway, so in my self-perception, this was a legal jihad that I did, because I lost 1 year, and there's no point in describing everything, but I had to go from a local office to the headquarters of Bihar government, from there to the Dutch embassy, and so on and so forth. So what is happening? So my view of jihad is that, okay, in my view, this is something which is not fair, and I really fought for it, and I call it as a legal jihad, or legal bureaucratic, whatever you call it. Okay. Now, in contemporary India, the word has been completely abused, and now you see an endless proliferation of words: land jihad, corona jihad, Marx jihad, you name it. Okay, they keep doing, adding. So the implication is that you have educated very consciously through media, through non-formal channels, a whole generation in which the impression is that jihad is a dirty word. It means only regression, it only means violence, and so on and so forth, right? And it is completely against the self-view of Muslims. So you are using this word to describe Muslims as aggressor, as violent, as somebody who is not accommodative. Okay? Although the truth is quite the opposite. So now, why this is happening? Okay? So this abuse is necessary both domestically as well as internationally. Okay? And that is where my analytical move is what might be described as displacement. Now, that displacement is this, that the world order after World War II, the nation state, okay, it is fraught with lot of conceptual inconsistencies. Now, after the fall of the USSR, what many people also describe it as neoliberalism. So until USSR existed, the so-called welfare system in European countries, including our own country called India, they had something like planning commission and so on and so forth, which was a 5-year plan and so on and so forth. So there was this welfare-oriented politics. Okay. Now you have a lumpen capitalistic growth. Okay, which is at the cost of the rights and dignity of common people, or what in the Marxist terms used to be described as proletariat, in Gramscian term as subaltern. And this crisis was in the case of Britain, Margaret Thatcher inaugurated it. So this reorientation, okay, is one factor, but also the crisis of nationalism itself is never made as a point of discussion. Now, if you see the Israeli state terrorism, okay, which on is, because this is the first televised, or you could say millions watch that genocide, but nobody is making any connection that what is the connection between this genocide and nationalism. And to me, it is very apparent that it is a nationalist onslaught, because the idea is to create an Israeli state of the Jews, and these Palestinians are a disturbance in that idea of a so-called Zionist homeland. Okay, so there are two elements. One is the territorial expansionist desire, okay, and the other is that these are not the Jewish people and they need to be get rid of. But nobody is talking about the fact that this genocide has a strong, I'm not saying that it is reducible to nationalism. What I'm saying is that for me, this explanation will not be possible, or it will not be a holistic explanation, unless we also take into account how nationalism has been a major driving force of this genocide.
And all of the violence of last 200 years.
But then you may have movements for nationalism, but the nation state as a unit of so-called international system has still not come into being. So this is conceptually speaking what happens. All these ills which is there in nationalism. I mean, I don't think there is any nation anywhere in the world. There is a nation state. Okay. In fact, it is more useful to talk about a state nation rather than nation state.
Please expand on it. How is the nation, the state nation, and nation state different?
Because a state is a reality, and the state makes a claim that we are a nation. But the idea that I mean, here we might have to qualify this by saying that, of course, on the face of it, the idea of a community which is rooted in one particular memory, one language, one faith, one sentiment, okay, that is nowhere. Even, I mean, Switzerland is a very small country. Holland is a very small country. But even there, you cannot speak about one community. In Holland, the non-Dutch people think that everybody speaks Dutch, but that is not true. There is a linguistic group in Switzerland which is very small. There are people who speak German, there are people who speak French, and I think there is a small community of Italians as well. So in that sense, nowhere actually there is a nation in terms of one unified community. Now, of course, in India as well as outside, people do talk about unity and diversity, and they do take note of the fact that we have other religions and we have other cultures. But then, in that conception, also there is a sense of hierarchy. The core culture, the core religion, okay, and the rest has to subordinate itself, which in history has not been the case. Okay, so that is one reason I had to take an alternative explanation and to show two things: that we cannot talk about terrorism without interrogating the idea of the nation state. And if you take this argument a little further, then the implication is this: that actually nationalism is the underbelly of terrorism. And that is where I do a case study of three nation states: Burma, which is now called Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and then India. So, whatever, after 9/11, the main so-called terrorist organization in India was SIMI. Then it became Indian Mujahideen, and then it kept on changing the name, the way we know through media. And of course, in Sri Lanka, it is LTTE, and then the Buddhist onslaught or Buddhist terrorism against Rohingyas, right? But in all these three nation states, you cannot think about these, what media or politicians describe as terrorism, without understanding the fundamental ideology of nationalism. Because in the case of LTTE, this is a Sinhala majority country, and the Sinhala speakers, who are also Buddhist in most cases, they were imposing their version of nation and community and excluding the Tamils, most of whom were Hindus, but some were also Muslims and some were also Christians, but their language is Tamil. So the protest against this Sinhala majoritarian nationalism began in colleges. Now, likewise, in the case of so just to speak about LTT terrorism, and so, by the way, in the case of LTT terrorism, you don't say that it is a Hindu terrorism. Okay, it is a Tamil terrorism. So then the identity is linguistic, even though majority of the people were Hindus. No, not all of them. But if we set aside the religious level, but then the question is we cannot simply keep talking about LTT, terrorism, and so on. No, the demands of before LTT was formed, of course, Tamil people, they were saying that, look, how can you exclude us linguistically? And the linguistic, because once you declare Sinhala as the official language, that would also have an impact on your jobs, economy, and so on and so forth. Now, in the case of Myanmar or Burma, of course, there is also a Buddhist dimension because these Rohingyas in the area where they were in a majority, the Buddhist monks, they said that, well, that place was visited by Buddha. To what extent it is true or not, but then it becomes a sacred land, and if it is a sacred land, then it means that Muslims have to leave. So, of course, this is rooted into the idea of the nation state, and likewise with Simi. I mean, Simi's radicalization, it happens in the wake of the fervent and violent movement to destroy Babri Masjid. And of course, Babri Masjid is connected to a chauvinist Hindu supremacist idea that India is of Hindus, and this unsubstantiated, undocumented idea that beneath the masjid lies the rubbles of a destroyed temple. So, of course, it is connected to the idea of the nation state. And likewise, you can extend to the case of Israel, because Israel itself was born out of terrorism as a nation state. And then the current genocidal violence against Palestinians is basically to realize that goal which was initiated after the Balfour Declaration. So that is how I think that a true and a genuine and analytically fruitful discussion about terrorism is possible only by bringing the question of nation state and nationalism right at the center. And that is what I saw that in this UNDP conference which I attended in Oslo. They were talking about all other factors except nation and nationalism. And then the question would be, why is it the case? And there can be many explanations, but in my understanding, it is simply because since the nation state is the foundation upon which the Western world created an order after World War II, so that foundation itself cannot be subjected to criticism or cannot be brought to examination. Because if you do that, right, then you have to interrogate your own fundamental assumption. And since you do not do it, then it has to be deflected. So it is displaced, okay, including, for example, if you see the black community in America, the kind of the kind of violence that they are subjected to, which was most visible in the form of Black Lives Matters. So the boot of the police at the neck of George Floyd, and then the guy is saying that I cannot breathe, right? That is terrorism. That is the example of state terrorism. And as you know, the role of Barack Obama was hugely disappointing because I think after that movement, he made a statement in which he said very little about the protesters and he stood on the side of the police. So what I wanted to say that this nation-state system and it's in the American case, if you see the huge inequality, American system is also infrastructurally very old. But mind you, I think I will not be able to give you the exact data, but it is something like this. If you take an annual count, so probably in one, I've given the data, I'll have to look at the book. So in 1 year, probably according to the media or the government sources, 800 people died because of terrorism. But during the same period, 34,000 people in India had died because of uh, potholes and ditches on the public road. But nobody talks about that death. But the death or the loss of life caused by terrorism is flashed on the screen day in, day out. In India, and you will see, I think I have also talked about Ajay Devgan, who looks very patriotic. You know, he's the guy who also does the advertisement of Gutka. Okay, and Gutka is
which kills.
responsible for thousands of deaths, right? So the point is, why are you not talking about these kind of death? So these are the ills, because in the capitalist system, this is a brand. Capitalists need it. They make profit out of it. So rather than looking at the main cause, you deflect it, and then the fanatic, the terrorist, they are depicted as the enemy, and as is the case, many people also begin to buy into that narrative. And it is precisely for this reason that I speak about narrative equality or narrative.
Yeah, which will come to later in the podcast. So the way I see it, your argument is structural and metaphysical. The primitive foundation on which the idea of the nation is construed and constructed selectively in the experience of the Western civilization and imposed on the world order as a way of post-colonial hegemonization, that has created a framework for which the malice, the subjugation, the unequal treatment of the internal other in a way that has been externalized to a Muslim Islamic external other, which also then becomes part of, because the nation states are not neatly divided, there are no neat, exhaustive, mutually exclusive territorial regions wherein nationalism can be philosophically non conflictual. For example, a Buddhist and a Hindu has different metaphysical demands on the level of ontology, on the level of being, and those mutual demands cannot coexist completely coherently. And then whoever is a majority will end up construing these categories in their own favor. But that also demands that all of this happens within the frameworks through which society is studied, geopolitically, sociologically, anthropologically. So then when we talk about your own area of expertise as a sociologist, anthropologist, you talk about anthropology as a field within which this question is invoked, gauged, understood. So there are two questions that come to my mind. One is the question that you address, how anthropologists have themselves dealt with the question, even the good meaning ones. But before that, as a practitioner of a certain field, why did you choose to study violence, specifically certain kinds of violence, in your own biographical account? What is it that you experienced in your own understanding while growing, seeing the way these categories were deployed, and how did you think you were locating them within your own framework, and then your critique about the discipline itself?
Ali, as you know, I'm not a great fan of this liberal choice theory. So, in
And
some ways, of course, we decide, we make decisions, we choose, okay? But in certain other ways, things also come your way, you know? So, in the book, I say that actually, when after my master's, which was at JNU, and then MPhil, and then I moved to University of Amsterdam. So I had not thought about the fact that I will be writing a book about terrorism. But after 9/11, so as you know, my PhD was about Jamaat Islami. And that was the reason I got interested in SIMI. So after 9/11, these people and other Muslims, they straight away began to be depicted as terrorists. And then, as you know, after 9/11, at least in Pentagon discourses, they used to make a distinction that, okay, these are Salafi, Wahhabis are a threat, but Bralwi and Sufi Muslims are fine. But that kind of debate or that image lasted only for a few years. Later on, it came to encompass uh, almost every Muslim, because you also had a discourse which said that unless Muslims reform their religion, and some people were also raising fundamental question about Quran itself. So unless you have that fundamental change, which would border basically on the question, which will border on the point that, okay, you basically leave your religion or abandon it, only then you will be admitted to this so-called enlightened modern world, right? And that is where I think, my sense is that, Mahmoud Mamdani has made a useful contribution in terms of good Muslim, bad Muslim. But I think a more accurate and a more encompassing description is basically not the distinction between good Muslim and bad Muslim. I think we have reached a point now where actually a good Muslim is basically an anti-Muslim. So this is not to say that the distinction between good and bad Muslim is not useful. But another way to look at it is that in contemporary times, in the Western, in the Indian, in the Zionist discourse, a good Muslim is basically an anti-Muslim. The one who consciously and actively opposes it, denigrates it, makes fun of it. So just think about the fact that, India has hosted people like Taslima Nasreen, Tariq Fateh, right? These are basically not Indian citizens, but they have been hosted in the name of so-called freedom of speech, right? And what is their job? Their job is to make fun of Islam and Muslims. Now, this phenomenon is not limited to India. You could think about Irshad Manji in Canada, and Ian Hirschel, who was a Dutch member of parliament, and now she has moved to the US. And you could also think about what was the name of that person from Lucknow who was a Shia, Wasim Rizvi or somebody. So he initially he began to make fun of Islam, okay, and later on, of course, he converted to Hinduism. And Ian Hirschali, who is a Muslim of African origin, now she has converted to Christianity. So, which is to say that in as much as the good versus bad Muslim distinction is useful, another way to look at this question is to see the way the world is moving towards and the kind of dominant discourse which operates in contemporary times in India, in Europe, and elsewhere. In this discourse, a good Muslim is basically anti-Muslim. So this is one thing. But your main question was how I got to right, and also how I got to the to a study terrorism. So what I wanted to say is that I was interested in Jamaat Islami before 9/11. I wrote my PhD. And then people similar to them or SIMI, they all began to be described as terrorists and the larger Muslim community. And then I talked about how the initial distinction between, Sufi Muslim or Brelvi Muslim being good, and then the Wahhabi and the Reformist being not good. And from there, we move to this distinction that Mahmoud Mamdani makes between good Muslim and bad Muslim. And then I made a qualification or introduced a new way of describing it, namely that a good Muslim in the Western security discourse, and that discourse is also adopted and embraced by people outside the West. In that discourse, a good Muslim is basically an anti-Muslim. Now, the question of anthropology. So this is because I was trained in Jamia Millia Islamia in sociology, and in India, I mean, in the Western world, you make a huge distinction between sociology and anthropology. In India, much less. So from my bachelor's, then to JNU, which was in sociology, and then in Amsterdam, it was anthropology. So I have been trained in the history of the discipline. I like it on many accounts. But then I thought that the question of terrorism that I later became interested in, to what extent anthropology can help us. Okay, so I have already talked to you about the Emic and Etic distinction, which is an
If you could
anthropological
also define
distinction.
what is anthropology so that the viewers can then locate this discussion within the discipline itself.
Yeah, the popular definition is that sociology, or historically sociology, emerged as a discipline which studies contemporary modern European society. And anthropology was a discipline which emerged to develop the other, the primitive society. Societies, so there were many terms which were used as the subject matter of anthropology: the primitive, the pre-literate, pre-industrial, tribe, race, and so on and so forth. So that was in the initial moment. Okay, so people. So actually, here you might find it useful that Orientalism as a discipline and anthropology as a discipline, they share a similarity because both were designed to study the other. Because sociology studies the modern European society, the us. Orientalism studies the other. Anthropology also studies the other. But there is a difference between Orientalism and anthropology. Orientalism studies that other which has a literate culture. It is inferior, it is supposed to be inferior to the Western civilization, but they have a literate culture. But anthropology studies that part of the Orient which doesn't have a literate culture, it doesn't have a written tradition. So the tribes and in India, if you the distinction is that sociologists they study villages and caste, and anthropologists study the tribes. Okay, so people in the hills and so on and so forth. So this my own training in anthropology. So in some ways, it was very useful, especially the Emic and Etic distinction. But then it also alerted me to the fact that when it comes to the question of terrorism, and you remember, I think it is there in the preface itself, where I take on two leading anthropologists, Iravati Karve, who is an Indian anthropologist, and she is also considered as the first woman anthropologist of India. She was a Marathi woman. And then Levi Strauss, who is considered as the father of structuralism within anthropology, a French anthropologist. So when after 9/11, as you know, people were saying that, well, Huntington introduced the idea of clash of civilization. And I say that no, actually, Huntington's Clash of Civilization article is probably dated 88, 89, right? Something like that, The book came much later. But if you read Iravati Karve, she already talks about clash of civilization and Islam as a destructive force and Islam as a fanaticism as early as 1946 and 47. And likewise, Claude Levi-Strauss in that book, which in English is translated as The Sad Tropic. So he goes to India. He also goes to Lahore. This is after partition and independence of India. And he talks about Islam and Muslims, and he sees nothing positive about Islam and Muslims, and so on and so forth. So my point is that long before Huntington came up with this clash of civilization, idea, you already had anthropologists like Iravati Karve and Levi-Strauss, who had been engaged in stigmatizing Islam and Muslims. Okay, and therefore, any anthropological exercise to study terrorism cannot remain loyal to these kind of anthropological writings which exist. Not only this, a truly anthropological, libertarian, or emancipatory project has to go beyond question such anthropological writings and come up with a truly hurriyat oriented idea of what an anthropology is. So this is the main point. And the second methodological point is that anthropology, historically, they have been concerned because ethnography is an important part of anthropology. So what ethnography means is that rather than making a comment about a particular community just based on oral sources or written sources, you go there and you spend one calendar year, you learn their language, you live with them, and you see what their life is. By the way, this idea of ethnography is quite in line with a prophetic hadith. So Prophet would say that you should not be making a judgment about someone unless you have done ma'amlat, you have dealings. Have you also gone with that person on a journey? Okay, so these are the ways through which you can know the person in totality, rather than just like what sociologists or political scientists do. They simply go and interview the person. So this is definitely a good thing, and in my view, it is close to this prophetic hadith as well. Unless you have done ma'amlat and you have you have been on journey with that person. So which is to say that rather than rushing to pass a judgment or form an opinion about a person or about a particular community, you should have sustained interaction with them to form a valid opinion or judgment about that community or that person. So in that sense, anthropology is very ethnography is as a part of anthropology is very good. But then the problem is that a subject like terrorism, okay, cannot be understood simply at the local level. And if you remember, I think in chapter 2, I give a chart, okay, and the chart is this: that in America, in Canada, in Norway, in Australia, and in India. So these are 5 nation states, so geographically apart from each other. But in all these nation states, there is one slogan which is so powerful, namely, all Muslims are not terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. Now, so my point is, how can we understand this formulation, which is visible and ruthlessly depicted by media in America, in Norway, in Australia, and in India? You cannot simply do it. I mean, of course, if you are a very rich anthropologist and you have like a team of 50 ethnographers, you can send them to all these contexts, and then they can live there for a year and then can do ethnography, right? But that doesn't seem like a very viable option at the moment. So the point is, if this slogan or this view is so pervasive in 4 different locations, 4 different nation states, 4 different continents, then the anthropologists focus simply on the local, okay, or the local community is not helpful to understand a phenomenon like terrorism. And therefore, I make a methodological shift that we need a different kind of a scale, and I call it anthropology or ethnography on an awkward scale, okay, which is to say that we have to create an anthropology which is sensitive. So the point is not to abandon the proximity that ethnography allows you, by the way. Okay, if as a journalist you just go for one day, of course you get to see something, but as an ethnographer, if you know the language, you have lived there, you know their sensibility, that is a great tool. It really allows you a different perspective, so that is fine, but it cannot remain limited to that. It has to go beyond that specificity and try to see the connection that exists beyond that locality, at the national level, at the regional level, at the international level. And finally, because my argument is about the new world order, which needs the category of the terrorist, to sustain itself, to enchant itself, because it lacks a positive identity of its own. And therefore, the question of terrorism cannot be really understood simply at the local level. We need a kind of holism in which the local, the regional, the national, the international, or the global, they all come together to allow us to formulate a perspective in which we can see things in their true light.
Interestingly, for a statement like this, which you mentioned, all Muslims are not terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. That statement, to be acceptable as true, globally speaking, what you're suggesting in a negative form has already been performed in the academia, in the geopolitics, in the spheres of understanding and influence. That kind of understanding could be imposed and shaped. But as you're arguing that within the field of anthropology, the methodology is isolationist, that you isolate yourself to a small economy, to a small locality, and then study it from inward without really understanding it as an embedded locality within a larger global sphere in different levels of gradations, like state, district, nation, continent, and then the world. And all of these gradations have their own vocabularies, their own embedded realities, interconnectedness, within which this experience and this articulation of terrorism and other such categories live. So it's a problem of that you are isolating yourself at a scale which is not exhaustive and comprehensive enough to really understand that issue. And that is, I think, structurally speaking, it is a larger argument, not just located towards terrorism, but any category or any understanding to be made, anthropologically speaking, requires what you call that scaling up, if I'm understanding it right.
That is almost correct, in the sense that ethnography allows you depth. So there is a distinction which some people make between worm view and bird view. You see, worm like insect, right? So if you just look at the insect, which is whatever, if you are plowing or things like that, worm and insect. So we need to know worm and insect, but birds, because they look at things from above, right? So the question is not going or celebrating just one of them. One has to synthesize and combine. So my point is that ethnography is good in terms of depth, okay? But this depth can also be extended rather than limiting it to one locality. Can we extend it? So in other words, I think you use the word called escape. So should our plane of explanation, or in other words, what should be the explanatory scale? Will the explanatory state would be a village, a tribe, a neighborhood of New Delhi, or a neighborhood of Istanbul or Kuala Lumpur? Or should we? So the point is not to abandon that neighborhood or village or locality, but to see it in a way that it can also account for the regional, the national, and in the international and the global, and see them dialectically. So my point is, so the point is not to say that okay, a neighborhood in Delhi is affected by the transnational or the global or in the international forces. The other way around is also true.
Exactly.
So it is a dialectical wholeness that we must strive to achieve.
Also, for example, the way I'm seeing it, even we've talked about the nation state, we've talked about the new world order. So, because a lot of knowledge that we see as standard today comes from these Western nation states as given, although that is now being contested, historically speaking, and even in the ways that knowledge is being formed in different localities in terms of states themselves. But that assumption, that knowledge for the last few centuries in terms of its global dominance has been produced in the Western context, also brings forth that Orientalist view that that all of this, what is being read, is operationally being read from a certain perspective. And so then when you bring that difference between real and true, what does that mean in the context of worldviews and in the context of those worldviews being deployed on experiences, knowledge, and evidence itself? Why do you choose to differentiate between these two ideas, the real and the true? For example, they feel like they're the same. Anal haq mein hi, I am true, I am real. And in many ways, realness and trueness is feels like that the two expressions from different vantage points about something which is, say to say, both real and true. I mean, I would let you explain on that.
Yeah. So what happens since we are operating in the English language, the book as well as this conversation. In the English language, before the Reformation, you do not have a difference between reality and truth. But in the wake of Reformation, a distinction is made, and that is after the rise of so-called Baconian science and positivism and so on and so forth. So, which is to say that science becomes the arena which is open to sense experiences, Hawasa Khamsa, or the five senses. Now, truth is something which is metaphysical and so on and so forth. So, with the passage of time, it was believed that truth is something which is in the realm of mystics. It is the job of religion, whereas the scientific thing would be concerned with reality. Now, reality, which can be understood in scientific terms through these senses and so on and so forth. So, you do have people who still talk about truth in philosophy, but not in the sense in which I'm using the truth. So, even people like Habermas or many other philosophers, they talk about truth, but for them, truth is mostly used in terms of propositional truth. But my point is not simply propositional truth, but the idea that because before secularization, God is truth. And once this distinction was made between reality and truth was suspended either in the realm of simply mystical philosophy, okay? Now, this will raise a linguistic question because this distinction between reality and truth, as it operates in English, then we will have to go into the different languages. So in Arabic, Farsi, and Urdu, haqiqat. So reality and haqiqat is of course derived from haq. And then somewhere I have also made this argument that tahqiq, the root word of that is also haq. So, in the Islamic tradition, you do not see the utter separation which post Reformation scientific tradition generated by separating reality from truth. And this is one of the good things about Shahab Ahmad's book, which I have thoroughly criticized elsewhere in my Rapopo lecture. But throughout the book, he translates God, okay, both as real / truth. So he doesn't make the distinction between the real and the true. Now, on the face of it, reality is something which is happening, which is obvious to our eyes, our ears, and so on and so forth. But then there are so many other things which are real, but I simply don't believe in it. In the sense that I have no sympathy for those reality. Now, let me explain this. Injustice is a reality. Okay, poverty is a reality. Prostitution is a reality. The brutality by the police recently, as you have seen in the protest in Delhi, that is a reality, right? Because you can see it, your five senses, you can listen to it. But then the question is not the reality of the phenomenon itself. Do I also accept it as something desirable, something which is ethical? So therefore, the task of a genuine or, in my view, a true scholar is not simply to explain the reality, but to also arrive at the true or the truth as a moral force, as a moral idea. But this is something which social sciences have completely abandoned. If you see political science book, sociologists talk about social reality. Political science will talk about either political developments, political facts, political reality. The question of truth doesn't feature there. Now, for my own, whatever little I have done, I do it because I have a sense of ethics. I believe in the true and the truth. So I write book, or if I intervene in terms of writing an article or just talking to you, my inspiration or my driving force is not just to, as the new liberal academia would say, that if I write a book, I will probably get whatever 12 points or 13 points or 14 points. These are the numerical points which the current academia understands, right? So there is something, and I'm not simply interested in reality in terms of the fact that as they exist or as it happens or as it is operating. I'm also believing in a moral world which doesn't exist, but which, in my view, should exist. And therefore, throughout the book, there is a question of the possible world, the true world, which, empirically speaking, doesn't exist. And that is where, much of the social science is also empirical. So my point is that our intellectual scholarly pursuit should definitely engage with empirical world, empirical reality, but that is not the destination or the end point. By engaging with the empirical world, we have to also be attentive constantly and perennially to the moral vision, the idea of the good, the idea of the public good, not simply for this community or that community, but for the larger humanity. And without that moral vision, we cannot be thinking about the possible world, because the realist, and by the way, in international relations theory, there is a theory which is called realism. And that theory was supposed to have developed against another current which was called idealism. And idealists were considered people who were sentimental or who had certain moral position, right? So
what ought
I think
to be and what is, the difference between what is and what ought to be.
Right, but as a realist, what is? Of course, there are so many obnoxious things which exist in the world, but that doesn't mean that I also endorse them or I also fight for their perpetuation or for their existence. On the contrary, these obnoxious things, I will fight for their abolition. And therefore, the moral and the possible war. Because without this anchoring, without this striving for a possible world, our scholarship actually cannot be ethical. Just describing the reality as it exists is not sufficient. The point is not to dismiss the reality. So, therefore, my formulation is that, okay, it is one thing to begin with reality, and it is quite another to end also with reality. No, we begin with the reality, we engage with the reality, and then by doing so, we also constantly bring the question of truth, the truthful, ethical, the beautiful. Okay? Because without that idea, I think to use this concept in a very perverse way, without this ethical and the aesthetic idea of a possible world, an alternative world, we would be just bare life or naked life.
So one of the things that this distinction then leads to between the real and the true is the necessity of framework or a methodology that can engage with the possibility of the truth. So in many ways, within the Western academia, in the past few decades, there has been a tradition of responding to the malice of modernity itself through frameworks like deconstruction, decoloniality, and more often, a lot of non-Western thinkers, including this work, for example, the decolonizing of the anthropology of terrorism, after especially Talal Asad, there has been the utilization of the decolonial framework as a framework in which you undo what has been done in a way that creates that reality which is oppressive. But in doing so, one of my personal observations in the past half decade or more so, when I was a student in JNU and I was observing and I was listening to thinkers like Jesai Deepak within the tradition of the Hindu understanding of their own civilizational ethics, they have deployed the same grammar to suggest a kind of decolonization which is at odds with what we are proposing. And in that, they locate thinkers like Shah Waliullah Dehelvi Rahmatullah Alayh as somebody towards whom all of these traditions within India, including the Jamaat-e-Islami, Jamaat-e-Ulama, the Tablighi Jamaat, the Ahle Hadith, when you construct an idea of coloniality in a way arguing that you're decolonizing from the Arabic and the Western influence, then all of these conceptual frameworks, in my understanding, sometimes feel like the concept of nation state or democracy itself. When you mention state nation, so in that context, while deploying these frameworks, how do we see that they're value neutral and a certain kind of understanding can be deployed to them? So when we are utilizing decoloniality as a framework, especially you in this context of studying terrorism within a certain field, how do you see that it is not different from the way the nation, the way other such concepts have been politicized? How do you see that utilization of your own in your own work, decoloniality? I don't particularly see it as something that can necessarily lead to truth. It is a necessary condition in a sense, but is it sufficient? And for that sufficiency to happen, especially when you mentioned the word hurriyat within your book itself, you open that gateway. What is it that decoloniality brings, and what is it that the limit of it remains within your own analysis?
So the first point is, I think, did you mention the name of Sai Deepak?
Sai Deepak, J. Sai Deepak.
Yeah, I think, in my view, that will not qualify as strictly a scholarship. It is basically a pseudo scholarship because I think he doesn't know what actually colonialism is. So to describe Islam and Muslims as colonial force, okay, and then think about decolonization. Okay, this is what is also, by the way, the current regime's idea of decolonization. The education minister has also referred to, not now, but a few years ago. So that kind of decolonization in another paper which I wrote, which is called Recognizing Hindu Orientalism, I clearly show that such calls for decolonization are basically neocolonization or recolonization. Okay, because in the first place they do not know sufficiently or adequately enough what colonialism is. So the point you are raising is probably it will require a longer treatment. But let me limit myself to the following: that once in contemporary times, there are many people who are using decolonization, decoloniality, and so on and so forth. So it has become a catch call, and many people are using it. And I'm not sure if the goal and the purpose of each person who is utilizing this concept is the same. In the case of G. Sai Deepak, and also I think I mention another scholar of Hinduism, Arvind Sharma, right? So it is very clear that in their case, the decolonization functions as a tool to aid the project of Hindu supremacy in the subcontinent. Now, to your next part of the question, my sense is that decolonization, and as I said, once it has become a catch-call term, people are using in a wide variety of ways, and not all of them are necessarily consistent. But the only point I want to make here is this: that decolonial is a negative referent. Okay, so we need to decolonize ourselves, which I think is a worthy exercise. But can we also ask a question, and that is, what is the positive agenda that we have? We decolonize, okay, in order to become what? And that is where I think sufficient thinking has not been done. Now, this raises a larger question about which I don't think I alone have answers, because that will require knowing the linguistic, cultural, and religious tradition of the whole world. And unfortunately, I know very little. Okay? So then the question would be how people in Buddhist tradition and Hindu tradition, in Islamic tradition, in Chinese tradition, or the indigenous tradition of Latin America, and so on and so forth, in Africa, where in many parts of Africa, as you know, it is the oral culture which is very pervasive and dominant, not the written one. So how all these cultures, decolonize is one, but also let's ask, what do we want to become? And I think we do not have, or at least to my knowledge, there is not much sufficient, thoroughly engaged research on that idea. That to me also appears because it is a much more challenging thing, because it is just like saying that, okay, we are fighting British imperialism or British colonialism. We are against British colonialism, but what are we standing for?
What is it that we're going to create after nation state, after decolonizing from the West? What is it that, as you rightly argued, the positive side of the agenda of what the decolonial self is demanding? And an associated question that I always ask, whose decoloniality? For example, when the Brahmins are talking about decolonizing from the influence of the Muslim outsider, and the Dalit is asking for decolonizing from the Brahmin, and then we are talking about decolonizing. So it becomes a triangulated subjective claim, which is readily deployable. So without that positiveness, what you're arguing, how do we keep on engaging with it positively? That is one of the most difficult questions that we see.
Yeah, and I would say that it is not simply decolonization in terms of nation state, which is very important because after all, nation state is the political wing of modernity, but also what kind of self we want, what kind of education we would like to give, uh, what 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 do we want our children to be in the next generation and the generation after. Okay, but also sometimes it may happen that in the name of decolonization, actually coloniality might be reproduced. But the point of this positive thing is something which has not been sufficiently discussed in the book. I just give some signpost of it, which is to say that. And by the way, this positive agenda will I can speak only for a limited knowledge of a certain tradition. So I do not know uh, what is there in the Buddhist tradition or in the Chinese tradition or in the Japanese tradition, for example. So therefore, based on my limited knowledge, I say that the task of a scholar in Islamic tradition, we write, and that act is called tahrir. Muharrir is somebody who is a writer, okay, and tahrir is a piece of writing, but tahrir is also freedom. Okay, and therefore in Egypt, as you know, it was known as Tahrir Square. In colonial India, we had organizations established by Muslims, which was called Majlis-e Ahrar. So that Ahrar is also from the same word. So if we think of knowledge and intellectual tradition in terms of Tahrir and Hurriyah, and elsewhere, I think this was a paper that I wrote after the so-called Arab Spring, in which I also actually give a concrete example by focusing on two works, one by Bernard Lewis and the other by Farid Zakaria. Okay, and these are the two scholars who have written about the Middle East. And I say that the way I think of writing, or the way I think of a scholar or alim, and I'm using alim or ulama not in the sense of just so-called theologian or clerics, which is a perverted translation, but alim as a scholar, then the writing of Farid Zakaria and Bernard Lewis, it is not oriented towards hurriyah. It is oriented towards continuing and legitimizing domination. Yeah, so this idea of hurriyah or writing or a scholarship, and that is where a positive thing, so not simply decolonizing, but when you bring this idea of hurriyah or tahrir, then you can have probably more consensus about decolonization, okay, but probably less about hurriyah, okay, and this itself can be an interesting question why this is the case. So Ivan Illich wrote a book which is called De-Schooling Society in Latin America. So okay, De-Schooling Society because it is a critique of the contemporary schooling system or the philosophy it is based on. But then the question would be, what kind of are we completely abandoning schooling, not simply as an institutional form, but what would be the positive way of a school, right? And that is where, given the world that we inhabit, with multiple faith, with multiple tradition, with multiple ideologies, finding a ground which is common to all is not impossible. It is quite challenging, okay? But in my view, it is doable, but that requires a lot of hermeneutical, intellectual, and scholarly work.
We've talked about the context, we've talked about terrorism as a construct, we've talked about the anthropology. and why in its current form it has structurally failed to take up that issue because of the way the knowledge system within it and its methodology is construed. It is possibly fatalist and deterministically incapable in the way that it is, uh, engaged. But the question is, because you've raised that question, there's a machine which is necessary to deploy certain ideas, certain traditions. One, of course, is the nation state itself. But within the nation state, which is now a democracy in a certain way, without, as you in the earlier form also talked about the narrative symmetries and the narrative asymmetries, two things I would want to talk about: law as a structure of the state itself, and media as a form of potentially creating that structure through consent. How do you see that in the context of the debate of terrorism? And possibly after that we can conclude, inshallah.
I mean, both globally as well as in the context of South Asia. One may have many points of differences with Allama Karl Marx, but his formulation of what he talked about superstructure. So law is basically a tool used by the powerful. Okay, there is a Russian proverb which says something like this: that law is like a spider's net. The weak get trapped in it, and the powerful simply peck it. Now, what we see in the case of terrorism, for this discourse to be operative, okay, it is not simply the case that one branch of the state machinery keeps it alive. Okay, there is a synergy between the different institutions, media, the law, the judiciary. And then, of course, there will be so many other institutions as well, including social media and so forth. But in social media, you can say that the social media is based on this idea of what is called UGC. Do you know that term, UGC?
No.
User generated content.
So the user itself is the content creator.
Yeah, so in newspaper and in television, the traditional one, there is nothing called UGC, user generated content. You are simply a consumer, right? But the social media allows this, But then the point is to what extent that social media will be effective, how many people see it, but more importantly, how many people are allowed to see it, because certain kind of social media profile which is based on UGC might be deleted, might be made invisible, and so on and so forth. So what happens? The law, okay, and in the case of we see this is so visible in the case of India, that about the Babri Masjid, the discourse of Indian nationalism, in which Indian Muslims and Islam is outsider. And this is, by the way, shared not simply by BJP or RSS, but it is also shared by Congress. Okay? So this idea has been there, and that led to the launching of the movement by Vishwa Hindu Parishad in terms of destruction of Babri Masjid. So you see, Indian nationalism as an ideology propels this movement beyond the Congress BJP divide. Okay, media plays a role in consolidating it. Think about Amar Ujala, think about Dainik Jagran, and think about Times of India and so on and so forth. And then ultimately the judiciary and even the Supreme Court puts the seal of approval. So what you see here is that all these institutions, judiciary, law, media, and political party would be in a democracy. They are described as an organization or institution of the civil society. Okay, so the civil society, you see a conjunction of all them coming together to uh, to produce, perpetuate, and ultimately make this particular ideology a success. And therefore, the task of those who believe in alternative kind of scholarship or alternative thinking becomes much more challenging. And this is the question: how to intervene, where to intervene, what are the ways in which you can intervene, and more importantly, can you intervene? Because now we are in the realm of censorship, we are in the realm of imprisonment. As you know, the book also talks about people like Sharjeel Imam or what is the other guy? Umar Khalid and Safura Zargan, and so all these kind of activists who have been thinking against the gray, and not worshipping power, they have been crushed. Many of these people have already spent years of life in imprisonment, right? So given this kind of condition, the task of thinking alternatively and in a way that it can fashion a fair, harmonious, and just society becomes all the more challenging.
On an ending note, you've done that by naming violence. In 2020, when you wrote about the Delhi 2020 pogrom, and people were talking about it as communal violence, riot, and the terminologies play a role in how the victim or who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, all of that is a game of narrative asymmetry and power. So on an ending note, what is the politics of naming, of categorization? Say, for example, terrorism itself, but also more specifically, also acts that are much subtler in terms of the daily violence that happens. And as Indian Muslims, as an ending note, what are we supposed to do, not just as academics, but as activists, as journalists, as entrepreneurs? How do we, give a counter perspective?
Yeah, so back to that 2020 pogrom, which was organized in Delhi. So one of the things which I said, that kind of depiction of violence, that it is from both sides, and I think I used the term called Ditto theory. But before it is understood simply as something which is specific to the case of India, no, I think as a scholar, I work through concepts, and I do believe that ideas advance. Okay, not by repeating and circulating and reproducing the existing concepts, but by formulating new ones. So the idea of the Ditto theory, it is not simply about Bhagalpur violence or Delhi violence or other pogroms. You see, Aung San Suu Kyi, the so-called icon of democracy in Burma, and the book describes her case as well, in which she, I think it was with Michelle Hussain, who was at that time BBC journalist interviewing her. You will find the description there. And she also says that, well, the violence was from both sides, meaning Buddhist as well as the Rohingyas. But in the case of Israel, they always talk about, you cannot simply talk about from those who are Zionist within in Israel, but also outside of Israel. They always bring this argument that no, we have to look at both sides, So this kind of Ditto theory as a conceptual intervention is not simply limited to understand the case of Bhagalpur or Delhi, but equally, as I gave you two examples in the case of so-called Israel Palestinian conflict, which itself is a problematic formulation. Or in the case of Rohingya, the violence was from both sides. And this is said by no less a person than Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been given Nobel Prize for peace or something. Now, on the point of what is to be done, or as in Farsi it is said, "Pasche bayat kar." So that is a big question, and I'm not sure if I have the answer, but I would say that people from different walks of life, you work in media, there will be people who are activists, there are people who might be working in IT sector, there are people who might be working in the film, there are people who might be working in the realm of education, and so on and so forth, right? So I think people, based on their own concrete experiences, okay, if they read the book and if they find something which is important, and it is quite possible that they might find something in the book which I, as an author, may not have even thought about it. So let's not assume that the author is all sovereign. In many ways, the author is not.
Einstein
So the
did not
point
discover the black holes. It was the understanding of a later theorist who understood his theory to lead to certain other concepts.
And therefore, so people with different experiences, and I would also in definitely, I think, gendered experience, and so a woman reader would not necessarily find the same thing as a male. So I think for different sets of readers with different trajectories and their interest and the field in which they operate, I think they might find something which is interesting, and probably rather than being or assuming a priestly role, I would leave it to the people and their own experiences in terms of what they find beneficial. And of course, something which they find they will definitely, I'm not aware of it as of now, because the book was published only a month ago. But it is quite possible that they will find some criticism and so on and so forth. So in both ways, to the extent that it is useful and to the extent that they find it is not helpful, I would be more curious to learn from them. Okay. Having said this, this much is very clear to me, and this is also based on my own role as somebody who thinks and writes, that activism or action, whatever field one might be thinking of, will be more fruitful and more effective only when we gain a conceptual clarity. Without a conceptual clarity, we might be doing tireless work, but it is not necessary that tireless work in the absence of a conceptual clarity and a conceptual consistency will really bear the same fruit. So the bottom line would be that if my intervention helps in some ways to clear the ground for analytical clarity, then I think that would be probably an important step towards thinking about collective action, whether it is in terms of activism, whether it is in terms of media intervention, whether it is in terms of pedagogical practices, whether it is in terms of launching certain kind of collective business or other kinds of enterprise.
Thank you, Dr. Irfan Ahmad, for doing this wonderful work. As I always try to think about scholars and put them in certain frameworks that I like to think how they think. I see you as a first principle systems thinker who is a synthesis thinker and who's able to massively deploy competing ideas into coherent worldviews to be able to understand certain aspects and concepts, and in that context to be able to understand terrorism comprehensively, not just at a scale of local, but at a scale of different nationalities, as at a scale of global realities, specifically with reference to its reification to a specific identity and ideology. I think for viewers, it's a very important work. One should read it, one should understand it, and one should be able to learn from it how deconstruction and reconstruction happens. It's not just deploying certain categories, it's about being able to internalize them and to conquer them in a way that it becomes meaningful to study our own self experiences. So thank you, Dr. Irfan Ahmad. I hopefully you're working on some other great work that would meaningfully expand our understanding. And I would also request the viewers to go through your work on Hindu Orientalism. It's also this massive framework of understanding this experience within India as a state. And please continue doing this work.
Thank you so much.